Hi, everyone. Welcome to our conversation with Stephanie Burt, a part of our virtual International Festival of Arts and Ideas. My name is Elizabeth Nearing. I'm the curator of Ideas Programming.
And my name is Alita Staten. I'm the Louise Endell Community Engagement Manager.
The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac in the land we call home, Connecticut. We hope that wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the land of the Native people whose lands you are on and the history of the place you're in. We'll pop a link in the comments that you can check out native land near you. And this year, our Ideas programming has been created in partnership with lots of local fellow organizations, New Haveners, and thought partners of all kinds. I want to thank all of you who've helped us make this what it is. We couldn't do it without you. And we'd love to continue centering your thoughts, your questions, your ideas. Feel free to pop those in the comments anytime throughout. We'll be able to answer your questions directly throughout the event. So comment and question away. This panel is a part of our Ideas series, which is sponsored by Connecticut Humanities, the Whitney Center, and Connecticut Public.
All right. And this event is also the launch of this year's National Endowment for the Arts Big Read. The NEA Big Read of Advice from the Lights is presented by the International Festival of Arts and Ideas, along with partners New Haven Pride Center and the New Haven Free Public Library, with additional support from the Institute Library, Nasty Women Connecticut, People Get Ready, The Word, and Yale New Haven Hospital Pediatric Gender Program. The NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with the Regional Arts Midwest. And so, without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this event and to welcome Stephanie Burt, our guest of honor, literary critic and poet, who is professor of English at Harvard University and a transgender activist. She will be followed in brief time by Eric Maroney, an assistant professor of English at Gateway Community College in New Haven. Welcome.
I feel welcome. I feel heard and seen, as it were. And I don't know if I'm an activist, but I'm certainly trans, and I definitely write poems, and it's a very, very serious honor to be virtually back in New Haven, where I lived, and I liked it there for a couple of years in the 90s. Welcome to everybody here, and thank you so much to everyone in New Haven who's helped produce this. I'm going to read a couple of poems from Advice from the Lights. And then Eric and I are going to have a conversation, and then we're going to have some time for questions and comments from our listening audience out there in the ether. So this is one of the first poems in the book, and it's called My 1979. I was Mr. Spock being raised by Dr. Spock. I was told I was free, but only free to be me. I knew I loved my digital clock. I would have trusted my instincts if I had any, or if I could have given them a name. I was deceived by the body that I mistook for a bad penny, by the shimmery beauty of my immediate peers, which I mistook for fame. By wearing them over and over without socks, I let my one pair of gold tennis shoes fall apart. I regarded the temporary reassembly of the styrofoam packing parts that came with small household appliances as a fine art. Inhabited by C-3POs, they became starbases or soft-focus, all-white homes of the future. I wanted to think that they had nothing to fear. I ate peanut butter and pimento sandwiches every day for at least a week, at most for half a year. I had become convinced that character was fate. Almost anything could result in tears. I wanted to stay at Allison's house overnight and wake up as a new girl, or a new mutant, or a new kind of humanity. engineered to travel at more than half the speed of light, but I wasn't allowed. My bedtime and I were both 8. I'm going to read a couple more, and then we'll go to Eric. There are a couple of poems. Oh, thank you. I've just been called inspired. Oh, thank you. A couple of poems in the book that were written right before we had to go to press on it, right towards the end of 2016, when it became clear what kind of kleptocratic narcissistic train wreck was coming into power. And I wonder if they're still relevant. I hope they're still relevant. This one's called Advice for Holding Together. Here is a shoelace, tougher than snakeskin, coarser than coat's wool. Under each spiral, a union of polymers structurally analogous to the transatlantic cable, to the supposed progress of civilization, to anything else you can worry between thumb and ring, held together so that it can work at all by the aglet at each end. What you can't hear may be deafening somebody else. What's almost too small to see may just be too far away. Be your own means of magnification or microscopy. Become your own indignity. And one more, and I couldn't decide between another like kind of trans childhood poem or another public poem. And I'm going to go with a public poem, one that actually goes all the way up the Connecticut River from the middle of Connecticut towards some national borders, on the theory that I think there are going to be some questions about childhood and girlhood and girliness and trans identity when the questions start, which I welcome, which I'm happy to answer. But this is a poem about a real thing that happened in American and Canadian history. And the end of it, and you'll see, I'm going to do a little bit of a quote mark there. When we get to the end of it, I'm quoting from a real document written by the people in question during the 1830s. And it's about a country that existed for a very short time and just had a few dozen citizens. And the name of the country is the name of the poem. Indian Stream Republic. No one should be this alone. None of the pines and their prepotent verticals. None of the unseen hunters or blundering moose who might stop by the empty lodge or the lake as blue as if there had never been people, although there are people, a few at the general store, and evidence of more in clean vinyl siding. And down the extended street, a ruddy steel pole the height of a child, its plaque remembering a place called Liberty at Indian Stream, 1832 to 35, between the disputed boundaries of Canada and New Hampshire, meant as temporary, almost content to remain its own. Each household, their constitution said, could possess 1 cow, 1 hog, 1 gun, books, bedding and hay, 7 sheep and their wool, secure from attachment for debt, no matter the cause. The state militia came to set them right. The legerdemain of the noon sun through needles and leaves, revealing almost nothing, falls across thin shadows, thin trace of American wheels and hands for such high soil and such short reward. The people do hereby mutually agree to form themselves into a body politic by the name of Indian Stream, and in that capacity to exercise all the powers of a sovereign till such time as we can ascertain to what government we properly belong. And that is a real place. The monument is in Pittsburgh with no H, New Hampshire. Very small town. And the parts of most of this book is in one way or another a trans book and a book about childhood and a book about growing up and a book about trying to find personal connections to people. But there are little bits that aren't. And a lot of the little bits that aren't, like a lot of the little bits in my earlier books, are about public belonging and public continuity and what we need governments and civil society for, what we do in the moments when we all have to cooperate either through our elected officials or when they're not doing their jobs despite them. And with that, Eric?
All right, thank you. That was absolutely powerful, beautiful. Just hearing the music and the lyricism of the poems come alive through your words. And I think what you ended with there also is the sort of thinking about the space that poetry can fill when our governments or our civil societies are not living up to our ideals that we have for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to start off thinking about just the particular moment that we're in right now, and a lot of the book deals with themes of identity. The book has been described as asking questions about who we are, why we make art, how we become ourselves, and yet in a moment when we're separated from one another, right, and our authentic selves are sheltering at home,
Right.
the many selves that we have collapse on one another. How is it that poetry can help us understand this?
So poetry, I kind of wrote a book about this too. The word poetry means a lot of things, right? And this is don't read poetry if you can't see the subtitle. A book about how to read poems. I like reading poems. I do that all the time. Sometimes I even write them. But different poems do different things. And it's a disservice to those poems to assume that the art form and the set of techniques called poetry always do the same thing, whether we're in a pandemic or whether we're not in a pandemic. Some poems are just fun. They're just there to play with language and really provide you with escape. Some poems are there to mirror an inner distress that many, many, many of us might be feeling. Some poems are there as ways of reaching out and making connections between an imagined author behind the words and a reader who is you, or connections, and Walt Whitman was very good at trying at least to do this, from one reader to another. Poems that imagined a community that came about through verbal empathy, through words that put emotions into multiple people's parts. And then other poems do other things. Other poems can tell you that you're not the only one who's enraged, or that you're right to be enraged, or that your feelings are shared. And lyric poems, short poems that are about the state of mind of a single individual, which many poems are not, are often very good at telling and showing that our feelings are shared and helping us feel seen.
Absolutely, I think, and necessary right now. I want to talk a little bit about time in your collection. Your collection seems to manipulate time, play with time. I don't know if manipulate's the right word, but definitely play with time. We're simultaneously capturing memory, but then reimagining the memories that could have been. Can you talk about the way that actual and invented memories sort of play off one another, how they help to construct the present?
Yeah, that's like 3 or 4 questions at once, and they're all really good questions. So there's a set of actual, childhood and teen memories in some of the poems, and then there are other poems that are built around made-up memories of, if I was this girl instead of a trans girl, if I'd had a girlhood, what would it probably have looked like? What memories would I have instead if I had somehow, grown up getting to be a girl from the get-go instead of having to sort of build it up backwards, as many of us trans girls do. So that's how the actual memories and the invented memories complement each other in the collection. If they do, that was the goal. There's a third kind of time besides made up autobiographical time and actual remembered time. I guess there's 3 and 4, and also public time, public history, who's president, what's the country doing, what's your state doing in the collection. And that fourth kind of time is the time that it takes to read the poem, the time that you're living in moment to moment as you are choosing to devote your time and your attention to some words I put on a page or over the air. And that time should be, if the poem is working, a journey worth taking, a set of shared moments where one leads to the next, and you end in a place that you are happy to have gone.
Mhm.
And that time can reflect or play off against the time passing or the growing up, or often in my work, the embarrassing not growing up that occurs inside the poem.
Can you talk a little bit about your process connected to the reimagined poems? I mean, I know you've alluded to it a little bit already, thinking about, what's happening in the context outside of the self, but
I mean, there's the process of figuring out what your life would have been like. And then there's the process of writing and revising a poem, and they're different processes.
right.
I tend to start writing individual poems when I've got a couple of words that seem to fit together, or when increasingly when someone else asks me to write something. I had a friend who asked me to write a poem that had allergies in it, so I did that. I had a friend who wanted a poem that had Laura Kinney, who is the younger of the two X-Men called Wolverine, in it. And I wrote a poem where if you're looking for Laura Kinney, you can find her. Although if you don't know who she is, you're not going to see her there. And it's just a poem about flowers. And I hope it works both ways. An editor chose to publish it, so someone liked it. So my individual poems start either with sets of words that I want to build out from, or with a commission. So I'm kind of incentivized to look for sets of words. But as with probably most writers, when I start to play with words, the pattern the words fit themselves to has something to do with whatever I've been thinking about. And if I'm thinking about childhood memories and about the odd subjunctive relationship that not all by any means, but a lot of trans people have to our childhood memories. Because we grew up as one person, but wished we were another. And I guess cis people do that too, but the particular kind of wishing of I'm being this, but I'm supposed to be that. I was thinking about that anyway, especially while writing this book, because it's a coming out book. Almost across the screen. And so that thought process got grafted to whatever I was doing writing the poems. And some of the poems came very fast, and some took 10 years from the first time I wrote the first line to the time an editor decided it was good enough to publish.
Nice. I want to dig into some of the My poems a little bit, and I was so glad that you read the My in 1979. That was definitely one of my favorites in the collection.
Oh, thank you.
So you've described those poems as being actually lived or as close to memoir as you have written.
Yep.
And I love that the ending of that poem, there's a power in the longing, right? From the youth voice that comes through so clearly.
Yeah.
And yet there's also that powerlessness that we get in those final lines. My bedtime was 8, but so was I. I think I may be butchering that
My
a bit.
bedtime and I were both 8.
That's it.
Yeah. Get the pun at the very. Actually, I guess it's
right.
It's Zeugma. I use Zeugma. Sorry.
So the lines that they evoke are like the longing, the power of longing, but also powerlessness. And I was wondering if you could talk about that tension and how it's investigated in your work, because I saw it come up in other places as well.
So I have a lot of speakers who are alone, and I have a lot of speakers who are very young. And I have a lot of speakers who are teens. Either they're human teens or they're, flying insects that claim to behave like teens. And the thing about being or feeling very young is that you don't have the power to do as many things as you could if you were a socially empowered adult. you are hemmed in a lot of ways short term. But long term, you can imagine yourself as having the power to do and especially to be lots of different things. Children normally can't drive a truck or go into space as astronauts or have #1 hit singles that are what would be a really fun thing to do. Duets with Halsey. I love Halsey so much. Or design the truly remarkable line of hats. But children might grow up to do any of those things. The sense of possibility that comes with writing about childhood and with a lot of the emotions of childhood, the idea that the future could be anything, is one reason that I think there's optimism in these poems, even when there's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's also true that children have big feelings, and it's somehow socially okay to have big feelings about very small things. Having big feelings about small things is, of course, what lyric poetry has always done. Large things in little packages, multum in parvo, as the Latin goes. A small object made symbolic, consequential, blown up, made to resonate. But there's something embarrassing or inappropriate or hard to represent when socially empowered people have those feelings. And really socially empowered people who we view as extremely responsible often have to hide their feelings, have to not emote when they're in public. And not everyone admires President Obama as much as I do. I understand, like, feelings differ. But one of the things that President Obama was good at was showing only the feelings that would help the people who were watching him. Right? And that's exactly what you want to do if you're the president. But it's not what you want to do if you are making certain kinds of lyrical art. And having speakers and personae who are remote from social power makes it acceptable to show and to explore big feelings.
Nice. Yeah, I think there's something also really powerful about expressing that longing that is oftentimes denied to folks as they are like moving into the world and considered more respectable, and so it's definitely a kind of power that you're pulling on there.
Thank you.
So thinking about young people and youth, sort of chatted about this a little bit the other day, but we were talking about virtual spaces, especially for queer youth, and sort of making a gesture to the new Animal Crossing that seems to be very popular with queer youth now. And so these constructed,
I'm told straight people play it as well. I mean, I wouldn't really know, but
I'm told that, or I'm sorry. So the imagined constructed worlds are important for young people.
Yep.
And I think that your poetry does something similar with playing with inanimate objects and animals and things of that nature. How did you come to the object poems? What do the object and animal personas allow you to communicate that a poem in a human persona may not?
So before I answer that, should I read one? Because I haven't read one of this yet.
That'd be excellent.
Let's do that. I've read that one a lot. Let's read a different one. Cicadas. Some people say cicadas. I'm never sure. I always say cicadas. Cicadas. They want it to be the same thing, to be born and to turn 17. See how long they waited. How similar they are to what they were. Stridulation is an educational name for their repetitive song that does not sound to outsiders like music at all. Litterbugs, shutterbugs, clicking practitioners of non-attachment to what was their skin and their clothes. It took such time before they could look you in the eye and make an impression beyond the asynchronous husk or mask of what they used to be. As you sweep the rest of them off the hood and front seat of your car, your porch, hat brim, etc., remember why they can't help but leave these hollow parts that were not so much theirs as them. We are already done. It wasn't fair. We will bury ourselves again after our one ride through your duplicitous temperate air. So those are cicadas. And they turn 17 when they come back after what's normally their 17-year time on the ground, and they have very little time to be themselves and take flight. And you may see them as a nuisance, but you shouldn't, because they're a metaphor for all of the things that queer youth want and have been denied.
I love it.
I'm glad you wanted me to talk about like why I write about cicadas.
Yeah. So like, how did you come to the object poems, and what do they allow you to communicate about identity generally and about gender specifically?
Yeah, well, it's a tradition. Talking object poems are a tradition that goes back much, much older than English. Poems in which there's a riddle and the object speaking the riddle says, "Tell me what I am." Inscriptional poems in which the eye of the poem is a tombstone or a door frame or an urn from ancient Greek. This is a tradition, and I love working in that tradition because I get a symbol, I get something that has sensory experience that can correspond to emotions. And I don't have to be myself as a human who's had one set of life experiences, and I don't have to pretend to be another human. I am not against writing poems in the voices of people who aren't you. I don't really want to write poems in the voices of real historical people who aren't me. With a couple exceptions, which are pop stars who have carefully constructed personas, I haven't done that. But is that true? Yeah, it's kind of true. When you're writing in the voice of a person who's not you, you become responsible for their real experience, if their experience is real or even realistic. And if you're always writing in the voices of people who resemble you, that feels kind of narrow. If you're writing in the voices of people who don't resemble you, especially if you're someone coming from a position of privilege, right? I'm a white lady with a pretty solid income and a lot of kinds of security most people don't have. And you get real questions about appropriation and whose story do you have the right to tell, and why aren't you letting someone who actually has this background tell the story and speak for themselves? And those questions of appropriation and ventriloquism and who has the right to speak for whom have one set of answers in the writing of prose fiction or of comics or of anything where you got a lot of characters. Because I don't want white people to have to write books where all the characters are white. But they have another set of answers for me if you're looking at short, inward, emotion-laden works. So one answer is to write poems that are very abstract, where there's not really an individual voice in the same way. And that's a valid answer. Another answer is to write autobiographical poems all the time, but I don't want to do that either. Another answer is to write science fiction and fantasy, because there really are, for example, Armenian American people of my generation who can speak to Armenian experience much better than I can, but there aren't people from Rigel 5 who have 3 heads who can talk about what it's like to live on Rigel 5 and have 3 heads, which is not a bad metaphor. And I teach a science fiction class. I'm increasingly involved with the science fiction and fantasy world. I love that world, but it has limits if what you want to do is write a 1-page poem that focuses on someone's inner life. because you have to explain somewhere that on Rigel 5 they have 3 heads and their primary sense is proprioception and thermoreception, and their music is microtonal. There's a lot of exposition you have to do that's fun in novels and okay in comic books and bad in one-page poems.
Right.
But if you write a poem about sexual frustration and isolation and the feeling that you've aged out of things or don't belong at parties in the voice of a flashlight, most of your readers are going to know what flashlights are, except in Britain where they're called torches. And you're not culturally appropriating the voice of actual flashlights because they didn't write poetry. And you're not responsible for every bit of emotion that you've recorded as belonging to your own sad biographical self.
Mm-hmm.
So, ergo, I talk in flashlight.
And I think the object poems definitely do wrestle with those, ideas of understanding the self or being uncomfortable with the self, and in much the same way that a traditional persona poem would.
Yeah, well, they are. I mean, it's not like I invented that, right? Elizabeth Bishop basically did it. Elizabeth Bishop's Rainy Season Subtropics, which is 3 prose poems in the voice of a giant toad and a giant snail and something else. Those are the 2 that I always remember. Do exactly what I'm doing in these poems. So I didn't make this subgenre up by any means. I just really like it. Stanley Kunitz did it too. Stanley Kunitz's Hornworm poems, which he wrote near the end of his life, they're direct precedents. They're him thinking about being sexual and romantic and in love with his wife and ambitious, and also being someone who's over 90.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to do that without being lugubrious or having people say, "Aw, you're still in existence and articulate, and you're so old. We love you, Stanley Kunitz," which in fact people did, if you know his career. But he was able to write in the voices of objects and insects in a way that avoided those responses.
Mm-hmm.
And those are some of his best poems.
So I'm trying to also just kind of underscore, I think, how fitting it is to use that kind of genre to try to get at the particularities of the trans experience, especially when there's so much like turfdom, like language around.
Oh God, yeah.
Like you're not allowed access to the story because whatever.
Yeah. But before I answer a question about access to trans experience, we should explain to our listening and viewing audience first that Stanley Kunitz's last name is spelled Kunitz, or Z if you're American. And he's great. Just I want to spell people's names Kunitz or Z. And TERFs are trans exclusionary radical feminists, and they're people who claim to be on the political left but think I'm not a woman, and I am. Trans women are women, tall women are women. Canadian women are women, trans women are women. There are different kinds of women, but that's what a TERF is.
So I think that kind of transitions nicely to the area I was hoping to go to next, and that's that oftentimes literature narratives about the trans experience are about like a finality, that someone has become someone else. You have arrived, and your journey is over.
Yeah.
And yet, go ahead.
Yeah, please take your bags with you when you leave the train.
We know so much of the human experience, it's much more complex than that. And then in the final Stephanie poem, right?
Yeah.
She ends with you have to look for, or the lines in the poem are, you have to look forward to until, what is this air, this space in which nobody, sorry, my notes, rewards me for conformity, punishes me, or keeps track of me, what I wear, how I see myself, or tries to tell me what should be my name. Why did you choose? So my questions are, why did you choose to end the series in this way? Mm-hmm. And what do you hope that readers will take away about the trans experience?
So should I read the poem?
I would love that.
Okay, final exam, Stephanie. Please turn in or leave behind any scratch materials. You have now agreed to follow all the rules. Good girls will be notified sooner. Next year you are going. You have to look forward to until. like walking out of an uncompleted pencil sketch, an unprimed canvas, the torn off end of a page, like being a bracket in a fragment of ancient Greek that I encountered in my best friend's photograph. Nobody is going to report me if I break down, break up, break in three, like a bone left to us from Beach Week's campfire feast, like the page after the last page of a comic book, like whatever takes place under the oblong gleam on microscope glass, like the white space between the grays of a birch branch shadow on snow, like the aluminum ladder in our basement on its side, on the cold concrete, going nowhere. It's June. I have a new and golden pendant, a folding hand mirror, a calculator too. Its heft in my hand grins like a mirror pointed back at the sun. What is this air? The space in which nobody rewards me for conformity, or punishes me, or keeps track of my time, what I wear, how I see myself, or tries to tell me what my name should be. So yeah, Final Exam, Stephanie, that was a fun poem to realize I'd finished. And I've gotten some really lovely feedback on it. And it's the last poem in the book because it's the last sort of stage of high school. This is a book about seeing yourself in teen experience when you're a teen and when you're not. And it was very hard for me until recently to see myself as an adult. And I, in some ways I still don't, and I don't really want to, but in other ways I do. If you don't feel that you grew up as a girl, that you got to be a girl, then how can you be a woman? And I mean, there are answers to that. But that's how I felt for a very long time, and I just couldn't inhabit a persona who had sort of aged beyond the end of high school when the persona was human. And I think there's still a lot to be said about the particular affordances, the potentials of representing teen experience. The world of YA novelists and readers is really just light years ahead of the adult realist literary world in terms of representing ways to be queer, and ways to be trans increasingly. And I'm happy to be a little bit of a part of that. And that's partly because it represents the rising generation. And it's partly because YA novels can be melancholy or lachrymose or tragicomic, but they can't just be a train wreck. They can't just be a sort of grim Beckettian or completely sarcastic version of the way things are. And if they tell the same sad story over and over about sad trans people, then kids don't buy them. So there's a lot of incentives when you're representing teens to get some kind of sense of openness of possibility for some of the characters at the end of the story. At least now there is. But the flip side of that is, where do you go next? I found and find it much easier to represent younger characters' experience. And when you get to the end of that, you get an exam. What have you learned? What do you do next? And it gets hard to see beyond that. And that's what Exam, Stephanie, which is a prose poem with weird line breaks in weird places that it can't quite find its form, is about. The other thing about that poem and about a lot of these poems of alternate girlhoods and talking objects and talking animals in this book, an NEA Big Read selection chosen for the Festival of Arts and Ideas in New Haven 2020. The other thing about this book is that so many of the speakers are alone. There are exceptions, but so many of the speakers are finding themselves alone. They're isolated, they're physically removed. Thank you, Tom Griggs. They haven't found community. And a lot of the poems that I've been working on, and I've been lucky enough to publish since this book came out, are really about finding queer and trans and just sort of weirdo and neurodivergent community. Which I love it. I had a much easier time finding, now than out. And lucky at my friends.
And I think that poem too, it resists there's a lot of discomfort there still. And so really even though it's right.
There's something really uncomfortable and kind of screwed up about defining yourself through school.
Mhm.
Because school is full of rules and school is full of linear evaluations. Did I do well enough to get an A? It's fine to be trying to do a thing that is evaluated linearly. Some people run track. You know when you're the fastest. There's a literal line, right? But it's kind of screwed up to be evaluating your life that way, or to be submitting all of your sense of self-worth and all of your life organizations to strict and heteronymous and linear evaluation, where your life is better if you got an A than if you got an A minus.
Mm.
I teach at a school that's been very good to me, but where a lot of kids come into that school and get into that school and stay in that school because they think that way. The most important thing is to get an A. And for a long time, I felt like I had to get an A in everything, and I couldn't, wear makeup unless I could get an A in wearing makeup.
Mm.
And some things, I'm never going to get an A in makeup. The one problem with this format is that you see yourself on a screen. And I really could have done a better job with this lipstick. I love this shade, but like it's not quite right the way I did it today. But it's okay not to get an A in a lot of things. The point is just to live them and to share them rather than to be the best at them. And as long as your sense of self-worth is tied to being the best at a thing, you're going to be uncomfortable.
So I wanted to turn a little bit. The theme of the Big Read is connected to issues of democracy, and I wanted to think about the poems that are in the poems that come a little bit later in the collection. They do offer a kind of resistance, especially thinking about the poem "Resolved."
Yeah.
But elsewhere, I was reading this article in the Harvard Gazette where you seem to reject the idea that poetry is always a tool for social justice.
Yeah,
Not that it could never be.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could talk about that. Like, what can poetry resist? Is it a form of resistance, a muse for resistance, a tool for imagining what's possible, what's impossible?
Okay, couple things. Poetry is absolutely a tool for imagining lots of different things. Some of those things have implications for the way we organize the polity, for how we make and amend laws, for what laws and what objects of law enforcement we should in fact obey and which ones we should resist or ignore, for how we choose the people who will make decisions on our behalf. Poetry can address those questions, or poetry can address other questions that are related to politics because everything is related to everything else. But many poems don't have to start or finish there, and many poems have a lot to say to us about how to live, but not a lot to say to us about whether we should be running for local office or who I like in the Democratic primary. The Ode to Autumn helps me live my life, but it really doesn't help me choose between two competing candidates for town council. And there are other poems that actually that are very good, thoughtful poems. George Oppen wrote them. Adrian Rich wrote them. Whitman wrote them. Langston Hughes wrote a lot of them. So politics is a subject. It's not the only subject. It's not always a subject. But I of course, you can have poems that are interesting and thoughtful reactions to politics because it's a big part of human life, but it's not the only part. But before we move on, I want to talk about resisting. Because I've come to sort of dislike the word. We do a lot of resisting. We should, right? We resist heteronormativity. I guess I resist heteronormativity just by sort of waking up in the morning and going about my business. Some of us resist very actively unjust laws and unjust applications of state power. People putting themselves in front of trucks so the Border Patrol can't separate parents from children are resisting in a way that is completely admirable. And when that was in the news, and I think it's still happening, although it's happening in a different way, I just sort of, a little part of me was sad that I felt I couldn't do that because I have kids and a job and like people I'm responsible to. But that's resistance. Resistance is great. Some of the most famous and effective political poems are poems that encourage resistance, that encourage opposition and rebellion and preventing unjust actions and undermining state power with people power or with individual acts of defiance. That's great. But it's not enough. It's never enough. As we are seeing right now, there is a role in any society that you want to live in for cooperation, for building things, for creating a space of working together, for paying taxes, which means collecting taxes, so that an entity that decides on the basis of representative government whether there should be a traffic light or a bike lane or a rule that says you have to wear a mask, right? Those are not acts of resistance. There are plenty of jerks who are resisting stay-at-home orders and resisting wearing masks and resisting getting vaccinated. Those people are jerks. They're opposing things that I support. And we should support them. I suppose this is a very incrementalist big government position, but honestly, it's an incrementalist big government time. And the nations of the earth that have had incrementalist big government, that have had not only cultures of resistance, but cultures of cooperation, have been the nations that have avoided killing lots of people for no good reason. And South Korea is a great example, because a few years ago, South Korea had nonviolent popular direct action, people in the street, that got rid of a sort of ridiculous and hugely corrupt and incompetent and dangerous regime. And now they don't need large-scale resistance, they need large-scale cooperation, and they're getting it. And people are being alive who, if they lived in the US, would be dead. So yes, some poetry can help us resist, but resist is resisting the orange cloud who says one thing now and another thing tomorrow, and accepts no responsibility for anything. Like, sure, I have a lot of emotional resistance to the idea of his having any power at all, and I would like to replace him with someone we should cooperate with. But cooperation is just as important as resistance to at least my political ideals and to the ones that are in those of my poems that have any kind of public purpose. I'm sorry, that was long.
No, absolutely. So, like, what I'm hearing is, in addition to resistance, poetry has to help us connect with one another.
Sure,
and
yeah.
imagine the worlds that are possible beyond that resistance.
That's really well put. That's really well put. And that's also, that's a blueprint for science fiction too.
Great. So I think we were going to transition to take questions that were coming from the live comments.
Okay.
Is that right? Okay.
Oh, that's really good. Should I read that aloud, or is it? I'll read it aloud in case there are visually impaired listeners. When you're taking questions, for those of us with small children, could you talk a bit more about those big emotions, about small things? So very true. And tell us how poetry can help us work through them. Thank you so much. I have medium-sized children now, but they were small before they were medium-sized. They're 10 and 14. And I write about parenthood when I'm not writing about the perspectives of children and teens and cicadas. And I think because lyric poetry that embodies inward emotions, can focus on one individual's feelings. If you read a lot of lyric, especially lyric by people who are maybe unlike you demographically, who are unlike you psychologically, it becomes maybe easier to see how something that strikes you as unimportant can truly be the end of the world to someone else. How something that's not very symbolic to you that you can just pass over can become a symbol of a catastrophe or of salvation for somebody else, especially if that person's 4 or 10, but even if they're not. I hope that's a useful. Do we have any more audience questions? We might not. Should I read another poem?
Yeah, let's. I think
Oh.
that'd be excellent.
Okay. How about fifth grade time capsule?
Let's do it.
Fifth grade time capsule. Having given the sun and school their expected ceremonious farewells, I can start to envision the future, my big reveal. By that point, everything I have kept between my boards in my polyurethane seal will have acquired fresh appeal as evidence from another age. A glitter pen sketch of a tubular rocket ship, an origami cricket notebook page, a jadeite earring, the Boston Globe, and a scallop neck t-shirt graced with an entourage of names in Sharpie, in graffiti script. I know I am too young to date. My answer to everything is, it's too early to say. Though I am ready to lead a long delayed or even a buried life, I dream of the day when I am decoded and vaunted, of a floral float in a parade, if not a chauffeured evening on the town. The people who pick me up can never be the same as the ones who put me down. So, fifth grade time capsule. Aw, I'm getting a yay message in my little chat box here. And I think we've got one more question coming. Oh, yeah. The question, again, if people are listening and not seeing, is what poetry have you read recently that speaks to this moment? And that's a fun question, and it's a hard question. I haven't read any books of poetry that have been published in 2020 that speak to the moment of social distancing and like the coronavirus moment. I think those books are being written now and will probably take a little longer. One of the things I've been doing that's partly for community and partly sort of escapism, in terms of reading poetry now, is reading 17th century poetry. Reading poetry by people who were attached to and sort of lamented the passing of earlier ways of life and wanted to reimagine social cohesion at a time, social cohesion and class cohesion, and also both rural and urban kinds of communities at a time when a lot of communities seem to be falling apart and there was a lot of political turbulence. I've been rereading Robert Herrick, Herick, who's a lot of fun. I've been reading poems, and there are not very many, but they're all wonderful, by people like Richard Corbett, Corbet. Poems that have pastoral elements often. Andrew Marvell, Marvell. I really recommend his longest poem, which is called Upon Appleton House, which is about the house in the country that he was staying in because he couldn't be in the city. And what the history of that house was. It used to be a nunnery, and then it was taken over, and now it has wonderful gardens, and it has places of retreat where the Eden story gets reenacted, and just wild, wild metaphors. Toward the end, he sees workers coming home at dusk who, like Antipodes in shoes, have shod their heads in their canoes. They've got their work tools over their heads. So yeah, rereading 17th century poetry as a kind of escape, but also in terms of the moment that we're in, not of coronavirus, but of a country that isn't really doing what countries at their best can do, a moment of rage at incompetence and denial. And also a moment, and that moment hasn't ended just because we're social distancing, when it's quite clear that we live in a society that's still got a lot of white supremacy in it from day to day.
Mm-hmm.
A society where there's a whole lot of just systemic racism that's not visible or noticed necessarily by white people like me. To my mind, absolutely the best poetry book I read in 2019. You probably know what's coming. and the poetry book that speaks to our moment in every line and that is really emotionally complex. It's got a lot of rage in it. It's got a lot of headlines, but it's absolutely not limited to anger and not limited to the headlines. It's also a very tender and a very private and a very complicated book. And it's a sonnet sequence. It's Terence Hayes's American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin. That title's a mouthful, so I'm going to say it again. Terence Hayes, Hayes, American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin. Everything he writes is good. That might be his best book. And it's certainly the book of the last few years that if I had to pick one, I would recommend.
Great. I was hoping I could squeak one more question in there before we kind of wrap things up. Okay. To take this in another direction again, many of the poems in the collection are moving back and forth between the sort of high culture references, classical literature, and pop culture references. And I think that's so playful, and it does something interesting with audience. But I was wondering if you could just talk about those decisions and sort of like, you know, how you came to that. And
yeah, it's fun for me to juxtapose references where one set of friends is going to get one reference and another is going to get another, and maybe the intersection of the Venn diagram is basically me. And I sometimes like being able to conduct deep dives into low prestige artworks. And it doesn't seem pretentious to do that in a poem by me in a way that it might seem pretentious to conduct a deep dive into a high prestige artwork that I admire equally. It is a source of amusement to me, and it's often a source of frustration, and I suppose a source of tonal effects, that different works of art that I love have very different cultural positions and are conveyed in different ways. You know, three of my favorite works of narrative art are Middlemarch by George Eliot, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and the Dark Phoenix Saga by Chris Claremont, John Byrne, and the other people who were putting together X-Men comics in the early 80s. All three of those are very different. They're all great. It just so happens that two of them have a great deal of prestige and are usually encountered in classrooms. And the third is usually encountered in, outside of classrooms. And doesn't have as much prestige, even though at this point I would say it's the most influential of the three. Once you start looking for the Dark Phoenix Saga in popular entertainment, it is everywhere. It's super influential and it's great. And I would like to have a world where George Eliot and Virginia Woolf and Marianne Moore were super accessible, where you would encounter Marianne Moore's poetry outside a classroom. And I would like to have a world where the Dark Phoenix Saga and Cryptus Exastra City and what else am I reading? Gem and the Holograms by Kelly Thompson and Sophie Campbell and collaborators. All my favorite comics are, most of which are fairly popular works. They're not sort of art works like Mouse. Mouse is great, but Mouse is in a classroom. Art Spiegelman's Holocaust story Mouse.
Right.
But I'd like to have a world where my favorite comics, which are different in tone and effect, are revered is even the wrong word, are widely available for close aesthetic analysis, where close aesthetic analysis of comic books and Halsey songs is viewed as worthwhile, and where the just casual enjoyment of Virginia Woolf in a non-academic context and of Marianne Moore and of Terence Hayes is something that happens all the time. It's really, they're all just artworks to me, even though they come to us in different ways and have different levels of prestige associated with them.
And certainly, lowering some of the barriers or boundaries between, academic thinking and real life and appreciation for just the arts in general.
Yes. Thank you. Are we supposed to wrap up? So go on.
Yeah. So I think we're going to wrap up here a bit. I wanted to thank you for just being so generous with your words and your thinking and sharing your poetry with us. And I think that our hosts are going to come back in for just a moment and say goodbye.
Thank you so much for this kind of attention. I hope we get to spend more time together in the future because this was really fun and really flattering. Thank you. Okay. Hi. Hi. It's Alita. Hi. Go on.
Thank you so much, Stephanie Burt and Eric Maroney, as well as Elizabeth Nearing, our ideas curator. And thank all of you for joining us for the official kickoff of our 2020 NEA Big Read program at the 25th anniversary of the Festival of Arts and Ideas. I encourage you to read this poetic text, Advice from the Lights by Stephanie Burt, accessible online at the New Haven Free Public Library, as well as hard copies available through the Arts and Ideas Festival for book reading groups while supplies last. Keep an eye on our website for additional NEA Big Read programming, as well as other ideas and performance events. Good night.